So Joe Biden tweeted this out yesterday in an attempt to be provocative and edgy and relevant and cringy. Who knows what it means? It's probably some reference to the game, the big bread and circus distraction I could quite frankly not care less about. I could not possibly care less about the Super Bowl. You would have to pay me to watch the Super Bowl. I couldn't give a flying F-U-C-K. Why? Because we're on the brink of World War III. I have some insider information today that confirms my suspicions about the expeditionary force that is moving into Ukraine. It's going to be a coalition of NATO-backed, not mercenaries, but actual soldiers under the guise of peacekeepers. We have very credible sources that are telling us that is about to happen in the coming months ahead because of the breakdown of the Ukrainian military. Right now, on the front line, they are struggling to mobilize these 500,000 troops that they want to mobilize. People are resisting en masse. People are starting to protest. People are starting to fight with the recruiters, who are really more like kidnappers at this point. And they're about to implement what is one of the most draconian mobilization laws ever. And people aren't happy about it, and people are starting to fight back. Recall my hypothesis that suggests that part of the reason why NATO isn't fully committing themselves into that region is because they know that there's a lot of potential turncoats and that the Russians have had a 50% vote in the past, and they could very well again in the future. And there's probably a lot of sleepers there who, not wanting to go to jail, they haven't opened their mouths just yet. But once it reaches a critical mass, you may well see another coup attempt, an uprising. And when that happens, the Russians are going to seize upon that, and that's when they are going to commit to a full-scale offensive, complete the annexation of the territories and whatever other territories they want. And when that happens, of course, there's going to be a massive shortfall in Ukrainian manpower that's going to have to be made up by NATO peacekeepers. Now, they're likely not going to come in under the guise of NATO. And I have to say that the source of this information that's confirmed that this, in fact, will be happening is very credible. Okay, so it's only a matter of time before this, in fact, happens. Now, what Putin has said is that he doesn't care if the surrounding countries, be they Hungary, Romania, or Poland, go in and break off little pieces of Ukraine for themselves. He says he's perfectly fine with that, as there, according to him, is a historical precedent to do so. However, the problem is going to be that for the first time, what you're going to see is NATO soldiers. We're talking about soldiers. We're not talking about mercenaries. We're talking about actual soldiers from NATO countries staring across a line of trenches to see Russian soldiers. We have not seen that yet. That is the next step. That's when this reaches the Cold War, official Cold War. However, there's still a hot war ongoing throughout that time. Now, where this becomes a problem is if the war is still raging and there is no detente in hostilities, then what you're going to see is those peacekeeping forces being leveraged to facilitate military logistics, possible defense, the implementation of no-fly zones, which of course is going to provide the Ukrainians cover so they can forward deploy their limited amounts of troops to the front line to fight the Russians. So while these peacekeeping forces are not going to be active on the front lines, they're still going to be inadvertently helping the Ukrainians, which will make them targets. Once they get targeted and once they get dead, that's when things really start to escalate out of control. Now, Trump came out with a statement today where he says he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to any NATO country that doesn't pay enough. And a lot of people are saying, see, Trump is talking tough. He means what he says, and, you know, he's not going to pay any more money for this Ukrainian nonsense. Well, here's the catch. All of the what they call intermarium states, which are basically the states between, you know, the old Warsaw, like the old Warsaw countries, between Russia and the West. Okay, so you probably won't be able to see this on there. See if we can get focus for you. Okay, so it's basically all the states that are colored there, right? The ones that separate east from west. All of those states, they already pay their fair share of NATO dues. In fact, many of them far exceed the recommended NATO commitment. Poland, I think, is at like 4% of their GDP for military spending. The expected amount is 2%. People who don't meet their commitments are countries like France, Canada, Spain, I presume. Many of the countries that are far back and don't matter anyways because they're untouchable when it comes to Russia. The countries that do pay their fair share are those countries that are right next to Russia, the ones most liable to get in a gunfight with the Russians. So Trump's tough talk doesn't pertain to the countries who are at the front line, who are in fact paying their fair share. So this is a virtually meaningless statement because he knows that, Spain or Canada are not at risk of direct attack, and of course they're going to defend Canada because if Russia is attacking Canada, it's nuclear. So these are just one of these statements that is very cleverly worded to make it seem impactful and seem like it's actually significant, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. In fact, what he's saying is he will come to the aid of those countries who pay their fair share. All the countries in the crosshairs, from the Baltic states to Poland, have been scrambling to give everything they possibly can to Ukraine because they know that they're closest to Russia, including Finland, of course. So this is just more bluster, more tough talk by Trump. When it all comes down to it, the agenda is going to continue. Okay, this is only the beginning of, this is like the Spanish Civil War phase of World War III, all right? So this dissent that is currently arising in Ukraine is likely going to be quelled by this $95 billion foreign aid package for Israel and Ukraine that is currently being rammed through in the Senate. Apparently a 67-27 test vote has brought it closer to passage. So it's only a matter of time before that gets locked in, okay? And they're going to try to get it done quick because people are resisting, a lot of distractions right now. Of course, you had that Super Bowl thing, and what perfect timing to serenade the Super Bowl than to bomb the living hell out of a place that has probably now absolutely one of the highest population densities in the world, living in the most abject conditions. Of course, I'm talking about the Rafah, city of Rafah, the Rafah crossing, where it was heavily bombarded. As we speak, hundreds of civilian casualties, over 100 dead, and basically, Joe Biden tweeting out laser eyes or whatever crypto meme he's tweeting out is in very poor taste in light of all of that. But it's just a sign of the times we're living in. I don't know if that was meant to be something cryptic in relation to that, but, and it appears as though Vivek is possibly going to be Trump's pick because he's just tweeting out a lot of weird things that a guy who was trying to get into a position in brown nose would tweet out, put it that way. And he was seen with Trump over the weekend. So it appears as though that's going to be the dream team, but he has to make sure, what is that one rule of power? Something to the effect of never outshine the master, right? So you'll notice that, and you notice this when when Trump won that one state, that Vivek was very careful not to outshine the master, right? Because Trump's got a big ego. So Vivek has to make sure that he's calling attention to himself and he's galvanizing people, but not too much to take attention away from Trump. So I think that that's the situation. I think, and honestly, it's a winning ticket. If you ask me, it's going to be very hard for the Democrats to put something together. I'm sure they have to, unless they're really trying to throw this one, which they could be. Apparently, Lloyd Austin was taken to the intensive care unit once again. So you got a senile, demented president who has the nuclear codes, and you have Lloyd Austin, who is incapacitated and who's handed over his duties to, I can't remember who is next in line, the deputy. But you also have Kamala Harris, who I guess is next in line to push the nuclear button. So yeah, that's where we're at with that. Okay, so I hope you can sleep well tonight knowing that. Cyber attacks in Lithuania, 30,000 electronic vehicles stopped working along with electric filling stations. So it wasn't actually 30,000 electronic vehicles. There was clarification on this later that it was the electronic filling stations that were hacked by the ex-Killnet group, a group of Russian hackers. Okay, there was also a Chinese hacker infiltration of U.S. critical infrastructure. Now this has been ongoing apparently for 5 years. Get a load of this. The U.S. National Security Agency, U.S. cyber watchdog CISA, the FBI, and the Transportation Security Administration said that the group known as Volt Typhoon had quietly burrowed into the networks of aviation, rail, mass transit, highway, maritime, pipeline, water, and sewage organizations. Talk about a royal flush of critical infrastructure. None of the organizations were identified by name, but the statement said that U.S. officials had observed the hackers maintaining access and footholds within some victim IT environments for at least 5 years. So what are they trying to figure out? What sort of malware did they place on these systems? What sort of dormant kill switches did they implement in these critical infrastructures? And how widespread is this, is the question. So when things really kick off, there's going to be a lot of things that catch a lot of people by surprise. I don't think that the movie Leave the World Behind is too far from the truth in terms of what we can expect. If they start unloading all these cyber weapons at once, you can expect total pandemonium. Russia is apparently starting to recruit mercenaries from around the world, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Syria, from possibly even North Korea, for all we know. I'm presuming that if push came to shove, they would leverage Eastern manpower in order to help fuel their human resource needs at home. They're going to have an endless pool of human resources. This is something to consider, and this is what a lot of people haven't thought about when it comes to just the calculus of the economic stratagem of World War III, is that Russia has behind it probably around 6 billion people, okay, who are probably willing to send them workers if need be. So whatever workers they don't have as a result of having to mobilize, let's say they have to mobilize 10 million men for some possible conflict in the future, well, that shortfall can be made up by immigration. You have North Koreans who are looking for employment. Now, North Korea, though, the only problem with North Korea is I'm pretty sure that there is an agreement that there's a lot of North Koreans who go and they work in the nether regions of Siberia, but I don't think they like them being too exposed to the outside world. So I'm not sure if you would find them necessarily working in places that are heavily populated where they could perhaps get a taste of what the rest of the world looks like. Got to keep them close to that prison mindset. But Chinese, I'm sure, China would be willing and probably will have some employment problems in the future, and they'll be able to outsource some of that human labor. India, Indonesia, numerous countries are going to be able to fill in whatever sort of human resource gap that Russia has, because of course Russia has resources. And so Russia's potential manpower that they can bring to bear is virtually infinite relative to the West, which, yes, there's a lot of immigrants banging on our door as well. And no doubt, I think that I stand by my hypothesis that the pathway to citizenship is going to be, if you go join the military for a few years, we promise you we won't start a war. When you get back, you can have your citizenships. Oops, we started a war, and now you got to go and die for your country. I think that was a scene in, what was that movie called? Gangs of New York, right? The guys come off the boats, they get here, go fight and die for your country, and they never come back. We're seeing unprecedented military activity near Taiwan. In January alone, 404 aircraft, 185 warships, 69 spy balloons, and 93 incursions of aircraft, into the airspace of the Taiwanese. So things are getting very intense. The Abrams tanks are shipping in. You have special forces currently operating on an island that is just 30 miles outside of China. So we are pushing a lot of people's buttons, and we're just asking for it at this point in time. Now, the U.S. is claiming, or there's rumblings, that they're going to be leaving the Middle East in 90 days. What does that mean? We know that when they're getting ready to leave somewhere, that means that they're just trying to fill, it's a game of whack-a-mole. It's a game of, the sinking ship, and you got to keep plugging one end of the ship and the other end springs a leak, and so you got to go and fix that. If they're moving troops out of somewhere, that means they're getting ready to move them somewhere else. It is possible that somewhere else is going to be in Ukraine in some peacekeeping capacity, but I do believe that maybe they're going to consolidate those forces in a safer place. They're going to move them to another part of the Middle East. I haven't really given this a whole lot of thought yet, but as we've seen in Afghanistan, usually 6 months 6 months or so prior to leaving a place, that's when a war starts. Okay, so that's when they're getting ready to move their forces for the next war. The Argentinian president, I don't know how do you pronounce his name, Javier Milei, called for the crazy-looking guy who's just another one of these eccentric nationalistic presidents, who really hasn't done a whole lot for his country so far. I guess time will tell. It's called for the demolition of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam, in order to, get a load of this, bring about the Messiah. This is the guy that put on the big melodramatic display where he was weeping at the weeping wall, and it was very cringy, to say the least. But as far as I know, the Messiah comes and doesn't the end of the world happen or something like that? I don't know. Anyways, it's certainly not the most empirical and scientific and statesman-like statement to make, but this is what we get nowadays. That's the best that humanity has to offer. That's why we are most definitely approaching the end. The U.S. has rejected Putin's latest call for Ukraine negotiations. I'm going to leave you with one final thought today. I was doing some research about oil because there's something about oil and war. These things just go hand in hand, but it's very hard to identify where the causal relationship actually is. Now, in 2014, what happened in 2014? Well, if you've been following this channel, you know Euromaidan, also known as Maidan coup in some circles, happened in Ukraine. That's when shit really started to intensify in Eastern Europe. Actually, it started to happen, well, maybe in 2008 with the Georgia stuff, but, generally speaking, right around that time, something very interesting happened in the oil markets, okay? And what happened was, it was the first time that the United States became the largest producer of oil in the world. That was the first year, and that was all due to shale, okay? And since that time, we have been peaking, okay? And you'll notice that there really is a one-to-one relationship almost with the economy and the increased output of oil. Now, most of the experts have said that shale has peaked, okay? There might be another, and in most cases, shale has peaked across the contiguous United States. But there might be a few, discoveries here, but by and large, it's peaked, okay? So we're reaching a plateau phase. There might be a few, ticks upwards. So what this essentially means then is that this is what's been suppressing inflation, this flood of cheap oil on the markets. And the U.S. is doing whatever it can to counterbalance or counteract the devaluation of the dollar and the decreased purchasing power due to quantitative easing by flooding the market with oil. Now, think about how the relationship with oil works and Russia. How is it at all coincidental that the war with Russia begins while the United States has vastly exceeded it in terms of oil output, when the United States, for the first time in, 40 years, was finally not only self-sufficient with oil, but able to export oil. Then they decide, okay, maybe it's time to push the Russians into doing something. And if you don't think they didn't push the Russians, and you don't know much about what's going on in Ukraine in terms of funneling the Ukrainians weapons, yes, Putin did invade, but why did he invade when he did? Well, it largely came down to the fact that Ukraine was being armed to the tits and was preparing for this very conflict by the United States, who was providing them weapons. So it reached a point where they had to either act, or Ukraine was going to, in their mind, become too powerful and too difficult in order for them to overthrow. Little did they know they were already very well armed, and the commitment of NATO to that fight perhaps exceeded Russian expectations. But I just want you to think about that, because what this means, and if you look throughout history, peak oil, the first peak in the United States, happened right smack dab in 1970. What was happening in 1970? The U.S. was just on a warpath, okay? We're talking about they did the Koreas, and they were just cresting in Vietnam. That was like peak year in Vietnam, I think 70, 71. And then it started to dwindle after that. Why did it start to dwindle? Well, the oil started to run out. Things started to contract. What did they have to do? You had the war in Israel, and then all of a sudden, you have to go into the Middle East. So suddenly, you go into the Middle East, and you got to get that oil. Suddenly, the Saudis start to produce way more oil right around the time that U.S. oil is peaking. No coincidence there. And then, of course, you go through this period of proxy conflicts. And it wasn't until the U.S. had this adequate surplus of oil that they said, okay, it's time to go back and mess with a peer nation, right? Because you can only fight those wars like Vietnam, where you're essentially fighting China and the Soviet Union, or Russia, like a peer nation, when you have that surplus of energy, when you really can control the fate of the energy markets. When you have that surplus, when you have that control, that's when you can go after the peers. When you don't, that's when you fight resource wars. So we have resource wars, which are like the Middle Eastern wars, where you're conquering for oil and resources and minerals and gold and precious metals and various types of just metals and resources. And then you have your wars of convenience, which are not really wars of convenience. They are existential as well, but they're more monetary. They're to diminish your peers' sphere of influence. And by peer, I mean an army which is on your same technological level of sophistication. So my theory is that this is why that it's not a coincidence that the U.S. is fighting a war almost with Russia. Basically, they are fighting a proxy war with Russia while the U.S. is peaking in its oil output. Now, with the reduction in shale on the horizon, the question is, are they going to start turning it up in Alaska? Are they going to start drilling in other places? Of course, as the surveys dictate, there's only so much that's out there. And the offshore platforms, even if you were to do that, the Arctic, these are huge investment projects that will take years, many, many years to get off the ground. So we're likely going to see a decline in oil, which may be one of the only things that saves us in terms of, if you look at the correlation, and I should say this is just a correlation, if you look at the correlation, the U.S. is less likely to get involved in a peer-to-peer proxy war when oil is starting to diminish. So I guess it's going to depend on how much shale we can pump out, how much we can keep this party afloat. But there's many other different factors here, and I'm going to do a deep dive breakdown of this. I have graphs and stuff like that, but we'll save that for a later day. I should let you guys know we are doing a winter clearance right now because we're trying to bring in a bunch of spring gear, and quite frankly, I'm starting to stock up on more of the bare essentials for the shop. That's, of course, food, things that are really going to be in high demand, personal protective equipment when this stuff rips off. So if you want to get yourself some of the best equipment out there, winter equipment, top notch, top of the line, I don't like saying brand name because, you know, a lot of people associate that with Tommy Hilfiger and Adidas and stuff like that. But brand name when it comes to survival gear actually means something. And we carry all the top tier brands that it's difficult to get partnerships with, okay? From Benchmade to Outdoor Survival Canada to Winnerwell wood stoves. We have a lot of different high quality premium items that you won't find anywhere else. And we're doing a 20% off winter sale off most of our winter gear. So that includes traction devices, snowshoes. We sell MSR snowshoes. What else do we got? Some other like survival winter related stuff. Go check out the links in the description below and you can learn more about that. If you want to get anything else at the store, my viewers here on YouTube get an exclusive deal, 10% off Survival Prepper. Okay, now is the time to stock up. The word on the street is that a lot of the non-essential items are starting to see what's known as disinflation, which isn't quite deflation, but it means that the inflation rate is starting to slow a little bit, whereas food and all the essential items continue to increase in price, with the exception of gasoline, of course, which is being heavily artificially suppressed right now and in no way accurately reflects what's in the ground or the reality that is right around the corner. So I would strongly encourage you to capitalize on that when the getting is good. Once inventory runs out for those things, we're not bringing it back until next winter, but I'd encourage you. Time is seemingly moving faster and faster. So get it while the getting is good. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Canadian Prepper out.